This message comes from Carrier, committed to providing climate and energy products and services to help enhance lives. More information is at carrier.com. Carrier, for the world we share.
Hey everyone, you're listening to Code Switch. I'm B.A. Parker.
And I'm Gene Demby. We've been watching, probably like you, as the Trump administration has sent troops to Los Angeles, where folks have been protesting and disrupting immigration raids by ICE agents. First, President Trump sent over 2,000 of California's National Guard troops to Los Angeles. But Gavin Newsom, the governor of California, was really opposed to that. He was not feeling this. He said sending troops to California was unconstitutional and, quote, an unmistakable step toward authoritarianism that threatens the foundation of our republic, end quote. California is actually suing the Trump administration over this, and Trump responded by calling for Gavin Newsom to be arrested. But the president did not stop there. He sent more National Guard troops to L.A. and now the Marines to the city.
Right. The president called the protests there a quote-unquote rebellion and said Los Angeles would have been completely obliterated if troops were not sent to the nation's second largest city. He called the protesters in L.A. insurrectionists.
And on Tuesday, when Trump spoke at the Oval Office,
we have people, they look in your face and they spit right in your face. They're animals. And these are paid insurrectionists. These are paid troublemakers. They're agitators.
We've talked about these exact tropes on Code Switch before. Outside agitators, which has been a tried and true trope since at least the Civil Rights Movement, calling folks animals as a way to dehumanize them in order to justify the future use of violence against them, particularly when those people are not white. And Trump's been flirting heavily with invoking this little-used law called the Insurrection Act. But at the time we're recording this, he has not done so yet. The Insurrection Act gives the president sweeping powers to quell domestic unrest, and the limits of his powers in this case are not clear. Can the troops use force on American citizens? Will Trump then be able to send troops to other cities? The law here is real vague.
Gene, it reminds me of the summer 5 years ago. The last time Trump toyed with the idea of using the Insurrection Act. He wanted to quash protests in Minneapolis and in cities across the country after George Floyd was killed.
Back then, his defense secretary stepped in and said the act should only be used in, quote, the most urgent and dire of situations, end quote. But this time around, nobody in his administration has spoken out publicly against him using it.
Yeah, it all feels so surreal. And 5 years ago, things felt surreal too, but for different reasons.
Yes, we were all obviously locked down because of the COVID pandemic. People were in their houses. People were on edge. And then the video of police killing George Floyd in Minneapolis went viral.
Waves of peaceful protests marched on, bigger than ever before.
No more silence.
From Washington's newly named Black Lives Matter Plaza to San Francisco's Golden Gate Bridge.
And the images on the news were so jarring. Lots of videos of stores burning and worries about riots and looting. But that wasn't all that was happening on the ground.
If you were watching all that on TV, it looked like chaos, like whole cities were taken over by clashes between demonstrators and the cops, tear gas everywhere, traffic stop, kind of like LA right now, where for most people in the city, things are normal. But something interesting happened in the aftermath of those protests in the summer of 2020. Polls show that over 60% of people around the country felt that police were not doing a very good job of holding officers accountable for misconduct, of treating racial and ethnic groups equally, of using the right amount of force for each situation.
Yeah, and that summer, there were mass calls to reform the police or to cut police budgets and use the money for other things. There were even a few radical calls to completely abolish the police.
But Parker, if you look at a lot of the polls now, people are answering those same questions about policing in 2025 the way they did in 2019.
Yeah, almost as if 2020 never happened.
Exactly.
And the number of civilians who were killed by the police since 2020 has been going up.
Yeah, last year was the deadliest year that we have stats for when it comes to police violence. So, we covered the summer of 2020 and all that energy extensively on Code Switch. But you, Parker, you were covering this stuff when you were reporting for Radiolab.
Right. So that summer, I was trying to figure out what the point of the police was.
Mm-hmm.
Because there was this idea that the police are there, quote unquote, to protect and serve.
Mm-hmm.
But apparently, the LAPD came up with the slogan as a PR campaign back in the 1950s.
The second serve.
Yeah. And over the years, the motto took hold across the country. But as part of my reporting for that Radiolab story, I learned that actually the Supreme Court ruled in 2005 that the police are not legally obligated to protect any individual person.
Wow. Wow.
Yeah. Which made me then wonder, like, if cops aren't required to protect individuals, how can they protect public safety more generally?
Right. And that's something I've been chewing on because, like, the idea that the police are there, as you said, like, to protect and serve you specifically, the sort of metaphorical you, that's something that a lot of us believe in the United States, right? It's because that very effective slogan, protect and serve, that's one of the things that's been baked into so much of how most people learn about the cops, right? Which is through TV and movies, and maybe especially the news. They're not having real life, everyday encounters with the cops. And so that perception helps shape public support for the police.
Yeah, and part of what made the summer of 2020 feel like such an inflection point is that public perception shifted so dramatically, and there was a lot of momentum behind changing the way police operate.
And that's what we're getting into today. Because we want to know what happened. What happened to all the momentum, all the support for reimagining the police that had folks out in the streets? Our guest today says that very deliberate messaging and branding, what he calls copaganda, is a big part of the story.
Copaganda is the way that the news and the police and the punishment bureaucracy distort our conception of what matters.
Support for this podcast and the following message come from Indeed. You just realized your business needed to hire someone yesterday. Indeed's sponsored jobs helps you stand out. According to Indeed data, sponsored jobs posted directly on Indeed have 45% more applications than non-sponsored jobs. Speed up your hiring right now with Indeed and get a $75 sponsored job credit to get your jobs more visibility at Indeed.com/codeswitch. Terms and conditions apply. Hiring? Indeed is all you need. This message comes from Charles Schwab. When it comes to managing your wealth, Schwab gives you more choices, like full-service wealth management and advice when you need it. You can also invest on your own and trade on Thinkorswim. Visit schwab.com to learn more.
This message comes from Discover. Are you still quoting 30-year-old movies? Have you said cool beans in the last 90 days? Do you think Discover isn't widely accepted? If this sounds like you, you're stuck in the past. Discover is accepted at 99% of places that take credit cards nationwide. And every time you make a purchase with your card, you automatically earn cash back. Welcome to the now. It pays to Discover. Learn more at discover.com/creditcard, based on the February 2024 Nielsen report.
Okay, Gene, who's our guest?
His name is Alec Karakatsanis. He runs this nonprofit called Equal Justice Under the Law, and they try to change laws that they say criminalize folks for being poor. Alec has a new book out called Copaganda: How Police and the Media Manipulate Our News. But before he did all that, Parker, he was a public defender.
And it's because of that work and our work in communities across the country that I became so interested in how so many people across our society who want a society of greater safety, of less violence, of more human flourishing for all, of greater equality.
And he's fascinated with how policing and punishment get sold to the public.
How so many people like that can be manipulated into supporting institutions and so-called solutions that do the exact opposite. I became kind of obsessed with what stories our society is telling itself about what harms us, what threatens us, what keeps us safe, what policies work, what policies don't, that I started focusing in on the propaganda all around us in the news.
So, Parker, I was just reading a survey about this, but the more local news you consume, the more likely you are to say that you are personally worried about your safety.
I mean, because the local news covers so much crime.
So much crime, yeah.
And I guess if you're talking about TV news with all the visuals and footage of that medium, it's really sticky.
Yeah.
Like all those viral news stories of like teenagers swarming into some high-end retailer or stealing a bunch of clothes and running out, or crime stories that are just like footage from somebody's Ring camera.
Yeah. Alec argues that those kinds of crimes are just like easier to show and less abstract than other kinds of crimes that actually probably hurt more people and have more societal consequences.
Things like wage theft causes $50 billion a year in harm, which is about 5 times all police-reported property crime combined. Or tax evasion, which is like $1 trillion a year. So that's like 60 times all police-reported crime combined.
But because of how much more there is in the news about robbery or violent crime than, something like wage theft, Alex says it means that we have this kind of like janky, distorted version of how much crime is actually happening. So every year, the Pew Research Center asks people about their perceptions of crime, right? And Americans pretty consistently say they think crime is going up. But the opposite is true. Crime has been plummeting in the United States since the early 1990s. Like property crime, violent crime, they are at or near record lows. And that's according to the FBI. And there was a jump in violent crime in the early years of the pandemic. But again, that was in relation to record or near record low crime rates. But somehow, Americans always believe the opposite.
But one indication that you're being propagandized is that when people are asked in those polls about their own neighborhood, they're much more likely to be accurate. They're much more likely to say something like, well, my neighborhood crime is not rising, but everywhere else it is.
His argument is, when your experience with crime is mostly mediated through mainstream news, your sense of how bad crime is more likely to be inaccurate.
And then the final thing, and this is probably the most important thing, the most important and third kind of major function of propaganda, the way you can sort of know if you're being propagandized is, are you being told that the solution to our problems, to all those fears, is more and more and more and more investment in the punishment bureaucracy, in the tools and mechanisms of state repression? So in surveillance, in police, prosecution, in prison. So if you were watching the news and subjected to like the actual scientific consensus evidence, you would be focusing on things like levels of inequality, poverty, access to healthcare. I could go on and on and on. What the evidence actually shows is that those are the things most connected to levels of violence in a society. So if you're ever watching TV or reading the news and you're finding yourself afraid of people who don't have any power and more afraid than you were last week or last month or last year, and then thinking that the solution to that is more investment in police prosecution and prison, where we're already spending more on those things than any society in the history of the world, then you know you're being propagandized.
So we were talking before about it being 5 years since the summer of 2020. And a lot of the energy around rethinking policing is gone. Is that just a product of propaganda?
Yeah, so I asked Alec about that, and he actually pushed back on the idea that the energy is gone. Like he said, okay, take something like defund the police, right? There's a really big umbrella, a really big range of positions. That's everything from like taking money from police budgets and putting that money into things like trained mental health workers or services for the unhoused, or for some people, defund the police in some smaller radical corners means straight up abolishing police departments.
First of all, I think it's a false premise that support for fundamental changes has evaporated. But I also want to be real. I mean, there has been an enormously successful public relations campaign, and I go into in the book all of this wild stuff about just how many people are working for police departments in information manipulation, right?
Alex says that the way people respond to questions about what to do about police depends on how they get asked the question. And he says police departments have spent a lot of money to help shape the framing. As one example, the Better Government Association said that in 2022, Chicago's police department had almost 50 full-time public relations employees. The Los Angeles Times said that the LAPD had about 42.
So that stuff matters. And there was a concerted effort after 2020 in that moment when there was a very concerted effort by the policing bureaucracy to scare people through a variety of tactics that I talk about in the book in some detail into believing that crime was going rampant because of the uprisings.
Okay, but Gene, another thing about the framing.
Okay.
Let's say a city had, I don't know, like 100 robberies one year, but 110 robberies the next year. It would be really easy to spin that into a news story that was like, whoa, crime is significantly up. Any town USA has a 10% increase in robberies.
Right, exactly.
But I think the way people understand it is as they're 10% less safe than they were the year before. But that's not really true.
And yet also is like, if you think about the fact that all of us are not equally likely to be victims of crime, it's even less likely to be true. But that 10% feels more real when it's like paired with a really compelling or colorful story about like a scary robbery, right? Like Alec talks about this a lot in his book, the curation of anecdote. Like, okay, remember those news stories showing videos of groups of people going into resale stores, like boosting a bunch of clothes and then running out?
Yeah, but to be clear, those videos really do look chaotic.
Yeah, they look crazy. They do. But there are even stories in which like CEOs were blaming an epidemic of organized, roving retail thieves for like bad sales numbers. It turned out that wasn't true at all. In fact, a lobby group for the retail industry copped to the fact that it wasn't true and publicly retracted that statement. But the idea this was a real social phenomenon with real economic consequences and not just, very visually grabby, isolated incidents, the idea was already out there.
Think about it like this. If you were to ask me to describe to somebody who's not a huge basketball fan, or to a young person today who's not watched basketball in the past, describe Michael Jordan, okay? Mm-hmm. I could make you a video of every missed shot in Michael Jordan's career. It would be like 9 or 10 hours long, just brick after brick after brick, Jordan just missing shots. And I could show this person the video.
And you'd be like,
and if
he's
they
trash.
only watch that video,
yeah, he's garbage.
They might think, this guy's not a good basketball player. He's terrible. He's trash. He may be the worst player in professional sports history. He just all misses. What I've done there is, through the selective curation of true anecdotes, I've created a false impression. This is exactly what the news media did with retail theft. And this is where it comes in with the volume of news. Do you remember there was this one video that went viral a few years ago of like a guy on a bicycle in like a Walgreens in San Francisco, and he actually executed an incredible theft. I mean, he somehow like made it out the front door on his bicycle. Anyway, that single shoplifting incident spawned 309 news stories across the country.
Wow.
Yeah, Alex said that we should think about how much coverage a story like that gets in the news compared to coverage of something of like existential importance, like, climate change or forever chemicals in our water.
This is one of the most important issues of our time. And it's not nightly news. The kinds of stories that are thought of as high volume news stories, like every single night on the local news, affect what we think is urgent.
So Alec argues that if there was a story about, I don't know, people being in jail because they couldn't afford to pay bail, right? Like a news organization might shy away from covering that, story in a different location. But that's not really the case with a story that's about a violent crime.
Can you imagine, like, if you go to a reporter in Cleveland and you say, hey, I want you to cover this armed carjacking, they wouldn't say, well, you know what? There was an armed carjacking story in Seattle last week, so we can't cover the armed carjacking in Cleveland this week. It's just not how they think about urgency of news. And so when you combine the volume of news with the selective curation of which stories are going to be told in high volume, you can actually create, as you say, this really sticky narrative, which is creating an entirely false impression, like organized retail theft is up in the United States, based on actually true incidents of shoplifting that conveys an entirely false impression to the public.
When we come back, how educated liberals might be particularly susceptible to copaganda.
The group of people that is most susceptible to being propagandized are intellectual elites, and particularly people who think of themselves as kind of like advanced, progressive, like liberal intellectual elites.
That's coming up. Stay with us.
Support for NPR and the following message come from Betterment, the automated investing and savings app. CEO Sarah Levy shares why they provide tools and technology for retail investors, small businesses, and independent investment advisors.
At Betterment, there is one unifying idea, which is the idea of expanding access. Historically, great financial advice was reserved for the wealthy, and what technology has done is basically lowered the barrier to entry and created an on-ramp for people earlier in their financial journey to get access to great advice. The same is true for small businesses, where mid and small-sized businesses have not historically been able to afford a retirement solution for their employees. So again, Betterment's technology allows smaller and smaller companies to attract the best employees. And then lastly, for financial advisors, what we've done again is expanded access by automating and using the scale that technology can provide.
Learn more at Betterment.com. Investing involves risk. Performance not guaranteed.
This message comes from REI Co-op. REI believes there are places within yourself you find only outside, where you can defy your fears, find your grit, and say, I did that. REI has the gear, clothing, classes, and advice to help get you there. Visit your local REI Co-op or rei.com.
Gene.
Parker.
Code Switch.
We've been talking to Alec Kirkatsanis, the author of the recent book called Copaganda, which is about how policing and surveillance and prisons are pitched and sold to the public in the news.
And Alex says that liberal news consumers and conservative news consumers, they're not really getting these messages in quite the same ways. So the kind of sensational crime coverage you might see on the cover of the New York Post or, on the homepage of Fox News is different from the way that these messages are spread on mainstream outlets like NPR or CNN or the New York Times. And it's the latter that's the main focus of his book. And I asked him why.
In one of the most influential studies in modern history on propaganda from the 1960s, there's a French World War II resistance hero and philosopher and Christian mystic and law professor named Jacques Ellul. And he studied propaganda from Chinese propaganda, Soviet propaganda, Western European propaganda, U.S. corporate and business and government propaganda. And he found something really interesting. Across all these societies, the group of people that is most susceptible to being propagandized are intellectual elites.
Huh.
And particularly people who think of themselves as kind of like advanced, progressive, like liberal intellectual elites. And he gave really three reasons for this. One, these people consume the most news. So they're basing their opinions of the world mediated the most, not on what they're seeing every day in their own community, but on what people who control the media are telling them about the world. So that's one thing. Second thing is they feel the need to have an opinion about everything. So when you combine those two things together, you create somewhat of a dangerous combination. But then the third thing is really dangerous, which is that a lot of really educated people think that they are impervious to propaganda. They think they're smart enough to tell the difference. They think they can be immunized through their own intellect to not be susceptible to it. And so that hubris is a huge factor in why in society after society after society, it's actually a lot of liberal-minded intellectual elites that are the most heavily propagandized by mainstream modes of information dissemination. And I'm interested in peeling back the layers there and helping people see that so much of what they see in the mainstream news is actually very similar to what Fox News and the New York Post are saying, but it's using language and sources and jargon and a polish that is actually designed to propagandize liberals instead of people on the right.
Can we talk about that? I'm really curious about that. How are mainstream news organizations doing the same thing without sort of making their audience's antenna twitch?
There are so many things. I have so many chapters in the book geared at the different ways this happens. I'll just give you a couple of examples just to illustrate the kinds of things that I'm talking about. If you portray, for example, as the problem as a shortage of prison guards as opposed to, let's say, too many people in prison, right? It's really interesting to go back the 1910s, 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s. You can see this throughout U.S. history on this issue. brutal violence, intentional violence by prison guards is portrayed as a problem of not enough investment in prison guards. That's one example.
And Alec writes in his book that calls for more police accountability often get flipped into selling even more policing and more robust policing.
I think maybe the most successful propaganda achievement in modern propaganda history is the police body camera.
Wait, body cameras?
I know, right? That's the same thing. Just to jog the memory, after Michael Brown was killed by a police officer in Ferguson, Missouri back in 2014, there were all these calls from the public and from lawmakers for police departments to adopt, officer-worn body cameras as a tool of accountability. So, we would have more insight into interactions between civilians and the cops, and it would maybe be a deterrent for cops from escalating violence during those encounters. But Alex said that's not really where the body camera story begins.
So, prior to Michael Brown's killing, the police and the multi-billion-dollar police surveillance industry desperately wanted body cameras. They wanted them for years. It was sort of the holy grail for them. They saw a new potential for a surveillance tool that every cop in the country could get their own surveillance camera, that they could decide where to point it, what to record, when to record it, how to edit it, and crucially, when and whether to release it to the public.
Even though police departments can have a lot of control with body cameras and the footage they collect, most jurisdictions do have rules on the books about how police are supposed to use body cameras, right? Police are supposed to tell people that they're being recorded. They're not supposed to tamper with the footage. They can only use the footage supposedly for law enforcement purposes, and depending on the situation, they have to keep that footage for a certain period of time. So these are the rules anyway. And while body cameras were rolled out more broadly across the country in police departments, after Michael Brown was killed in Ferguson in 2014, there were some police departments that were already using them, like most notably the NYPD. So the NYPD adopted them in 2013 after a federal court found that the police there were targeting minorities disproportionately in the city's stop and frisk program. The idea was that the cameras would, again, increase transparency, and that narrative around transparency and accountability, that really picked up steam after Michael Brown's killing.
After Michael Brown was killed, and there was no video of what happened, they weaponized that uncertainty in the public.
And it's worth noting here that the research on whether body cameras actually make the police less violent is pretty inconclusive. It's very mixed.
But even with that, they're portrayed as a genuine effort at transparency and accountability.
Just to go back to the media conversation we were having a little bit earlier, do you think messaging in liberal news media and the different kind that we see in right-leaning news media are equally consequential or equally as bad?
It's hard to know what's, doing more harm overall. I mean, I think that the right-wing propaganda is also very important, but they're geared at different audiences. And it would be impossible or much, much harder for a lot of these policies to actually exist if they didn't have widespread support among ordinary people who think of themselves as liberals, independents, progressives, etc.
The reasons Americans have distorted views on crime and rates of crime and what should be done about that, isn't just because of news coverage or the way that crime gets talked about on social media. There's probably no profession that gets as much airtime in popular culture and entertainment as cops do. There's an entire economy of true crime out there, wildly popular podcasts, documentary series on Netflix. Does just the sort of miasma of these stories, how does that change the way we perceive policing and crime and punishment?
The reason that I devote a whole chapter at the end to fortifying our minds against relentless propaganda and to how we can do that together in community with each other is because it is all around us. Every movie, every TV show that we see about these topics, there's a bustling world underneath it. There's a whole consulting industry. There's huge departments at hundreds of local municipal government levels. It takes a lot of money, time, and effort to convince people of the effectiveness of systems that are fundamentally ineffective. And to distract people from the obvious evidence-based solutions like reducing inequality, giving people places to live, giving people access to healthcare and treatment, early childhood education, lead abatement. And it's very important that when we consume the news, we start asking ourselves really basic questions like, why am I being told this story right now? Who benefits from it? What am I not being told? And when we start to ask these questions, and more that I go into in the book, you start to see that our whole perception of what keeps us safe and what threatens us and what are the solutions to all those problems is being distorted for profit, because some people in our society benefit from us not actually fundamentally addressing the root causes of the things that hurt us.
And that, y'all, that is our show. You can follow us on Instagram at NPR Code Switch, all one word. If email's more your thing, ours is codeswitch@npr.org. And listen to the podcast on the NPR app or wherever it is you get your podcast. You can also subscribe to the Code Switch newsletter by going to npr.org/Code Switch newsletter.
And just a reminder that signing up for Code Switch Plus is a great way to support our show and public media, and you'll get to listen to every episode sponsor-free. So please go find out more at plus.npr.org/codeswitch. This episode was produced by Christina Calla and Xavier Lopez. It was edited by Dahlia Mortada and Courtney Stein. Our engineer was Kwesi Lee.
And we'd be remiss if we did not shout out the rest of the Code Switch Massive. That's Jess Kung, Leah Donnella, and Verlin Williams. As for me, I'm Gene Demby.
I'm B.A. Parker.
Be easy, y'all.
Hydrate.
Support for NPR and the following message come from IXL Learning. IXL Learning uses advanced algorithms to give the right help to each kid, no matter the age or personality. Get an exclusive 20% off IXL membership when you sign up today at IXL.com/NPR. This message comes from LinkedIn Ads. One of the hardest parts about B2B marketing is reaching the right audience. That's why you need LinkedIn Ads. You can target your buyers by job title, company, role, seniority, and skills. All the professionals you need to reach in one place. To get a $100 credit on your next campaign so you can try it yourself, just go to linkedin.com/results. That's linkedin.com/results. Terms and conditions apply. Only on LinkedIn Ads.
This message comes from NPR sponsor Rosetta Stone, an expert in language learning for 30 years. Right now, NPR listeners can get Rosetta Stone's lifetime membership to 25 different languages for 50% off. Learn more at rosettastone.com/NPR.